I don't know if it was the gloomy sky or the instincts of someone who's done this job for too long, but that morning, something felt off. The sky was gray, like a thin layer of ash had settled across it, and light rain tapped gently against my windshield as I pulled into the familiar lot of Grantwood Industries. Nearly 30 years of working there. Never late, never missed more than a single day. And yet that morning, I found myself walking slower than usual, as if my body already knew something my mind hadn't caught up to. The 11th floor was unusually quiet. My footsteps echoed lightly against the tile floor, and the pale fluorescent lights overhead did nothing to chase away the chill running down my back. When the young assistant approached me and said, "The director would like to see you in the private conference room," I simply nodded. No questions. I didn't need to ask. I already knew. The room, once the site of countless strategy meetings, felt oddly hollow. At the far end of the polished wooden table sat David Lane, our new executive director. In front of him was a single manila folder. His fingers were interlaced, his expression unreadable. "Richard," he said almost casually, "you've given the company 29 years. That's commendable." I didn't answer. The only sound in the room was the steady ticking of the wall clock behind me, each tick landing like a knock against my chest. He didn't look me in the eye as he pushed the folder toward me. "We're making some necessary reductions," he continued. "It's a decision from the board. Effective immediately." I heard the soft rustle of paper as I opened the folder, but my eyes couldn't focus on the words. Everything blurred together into a fog. I knew exactly what day it was. 3 days. I was 3 days away from qualifying for my full pension, the milestone I'd been working toward my entire adult life. I stared at him for a long moment. David kept his eyes averted, his fingers now drumming the table in an awkward rhythm. Maybe I expected an apology, a flicker of hesitation, maybe just a moment of human decency. There was none. I stood up. "Thank you for letting me know," I said, my voice strangely calm. "I'll be out by this afternoon." As I turned to leave, my eyes caught the bookshelf behind his desk. An old photo still sat there, the one I had donated to the boardroom years ago. It was a picture of me shaking hands with a silver-haired gentleman, both of us smiling genuinely. I remembered that day clearly, a finance conference in Chicago 15 years ago. The man in the photo was Gregory Stone, and I had never forgotten what he wrote on the back of that picture. "If the day ever comes when the truth needs to be heard, call me." I don't recall exactly how I walked out of that conference room, but when I got to my office, my hands were still trembling. Not from fear, but from the way it had all happened so fast, so cold, as if 3 decades of service had meant nothing. The office I'd spent half my life in now felt foreign. Everything was still in its place. The desk facing the wide window that overlooked the parking lot, the tall bookshelf stacked with reports I had meticulously organized, the old leather chair with the worn backrest from years of long nights. But today the space felt empty, like I was packing up a motel room, not leaving a career. I closed the door softly behind me. I didn't want anyone to see me like this, a 62-year-old man, quietly packing up the scattered pieces of his life's work. I opened the top drawer. Familiar items sat in silence, waiting. A fountain pen Claire, my late wife, had given me on our 10th anniversary. Jet black, polished wood, silver tips slightly scratched. She once said, "This pen's for people who write important things." I picked it up, rolled it in my fingers. A strange warmth spread through my chest, almost like I could hear her voice again. Clear, gentle, whispering just over my shoulder. I placed the pen in the cardboard box that Janet from HR had handed me. Next was the photo frame from my desk. Me and Daniel, my son, at his little league game when he was 12. The picture had yellowed a bit, but his eyes still held the same spark. He's a grown man now, living in Seattle, always busy. Still, he calls every week. I hadn't told him about this morning. Not yet. I wasn't ready. Then there was the little cactus, a birthday gift from a young intern a decade ago. I almost threw it away once. It didn't really fit with the decor, but I left it in the corner of my desk. No one ever paid it any attention, but somehow it had survived every harsh winter and dry summer, just like me. When I opened the bottom drawer, Something slipped and fell onto the floor with a dry thud. I bent down and picked it up. A small silver metal box. Heavier than I remembered. Not many people knew about that box. I had placed it there about 4 years ago, after a finance meeting where things didn't feel right. I didn't open it just yet. I placed it gently on the desk. Looked at it. Like staring at an old friend I hadn't spoken to in a long time. I sat down in my chair, the one with the slight tilt and the familiar creak, and for the first time that day, I let myself exhale. Outside the window, the sky was still gray. The rain had slowed to a mist, but the air was damp, heavy. I looked out at the cars in the lot. Some parked in the same spots they had been every day for years. I thought about the late nights driving home, reports in the passenger seat. Nights spent reading through documents while Claire slept under the soft glow of the lamp. Inside the box, I knew exactly what I'd find. Hundreds of pages, documents, emails, memos, time-stamped reports. I hadn't collected them for any particular reason, at least not at first. But ever since David Lane joined with his polished smile and phrases like streamline operations and optimize cost, something had felt wrong. Numbers didn't add up. Goals were suddenly achievable with a little creativity. Explanations got thinner while applause got louder for everyone but me. I had filed concerns, sent internal notes. Not once did I receive a real reply. Just, we'll revisit this, not a priority, or the worst, let's stay positive. I never wanted to be difficult. I just wanted things done right. But this morning, being pushed out the door 3 days before my pension, made it clear this wasn't an accident. It was a calculated strike. I reached out and opened the box. The scent of old paper rose up. Neatly categorized files. Dates, annotations, even a handwritten transcript from a meeting where I was told to stop taking notes. But I kept writing, because that's what I did. I didn't see myself as brave or confrontational, but I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't let 30 years of honest work end with a knife in the back. I closed the box, slipped it into my leather bag. It wasn't too heavy, but my shoulders stiffened, like I was carrying more than paper, like I was carrying the weight of everyone who had stayed silent for years. I stood, took one last look at the room. The shelves were still there, but there was nothing left that was mine. Just the chair, still crooked, creaking quietly as I stepped away. I picked up the box, opened the door, and stepped out. And for the first time in my life, my silence was no longer submission. It was preparation. That evening, St. Paul was still damp from a lingering rain. The wind slipped through the window frame, letting out a low whistle, like someone whispering just beyond the glass. I sat in the kitchen, warm yellow light falling across the old wooden table. In front of me was a glass of whiskey, nearly full. I didn't usually drink on weekdays, but this wasn't a regular day. The silver box sat in front of me like a heavy reminder. I had kept it locked away for years, knew this day might come, but still hoped it wouldn't. The only comfort I had was knowing I hadn't ignored my instincts. I had recorded, I had preserved, I had prepared, but what I hadn't done was speak. I reached for my phone, swiped slowly through the contacts list I hadn't touched in a while. The names felt like a map of memories, people who had retired, moved on, disappeared, and then I stopped at a familiar name, Gregory Stone. Just seeing it pulled me back to that conference in Chicago, 15 years ago. A freezing hotel ballroom packed with suits and stiff collars. But Gregory had been different. He was the only one who actually looked at me when I gave my presentation, a risk assessment that most had tuned out. Afterward, he shook my hand and said, "You're careful in a way the world needs, but not built for the noise." I had chuckled without answering. Then he handed me his card. On the back, in steady block letters, he'd written, "When silence becomes a burden, call." I never did, until now. My fingers trembled slightly as I dialed. Not from fear, just from knowing that once this call connected, there'd be no turning back. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. For a moment, I thought maybe the number was old, that he wouldn't remember me. Then the 4th ring clicked. "This is Greg Stone." I paused for half a breath. Greg. "This is Richard Evans. I'm not sure if you remember." "Richard." His voice cut in, not harsh, just certain. "I remember. 15 years. Your voice hasn't changed much. I gave a small laugh. It didn't make anything lighter. I need to talk. About Grantwood. About everything I've been holding on to. He was quiet for a moment, but didn't ask for details. How much do you have? Close to 1,000 pages. Financial evidence. Notes, emails, even backdated documents. I submitted it internally, but no one responded. This morning they fired me. 3 days before my pension would have vested. That's why you're calling. That's why I'm done being quiet, I said, staring into the untouched glass. I don't know how to begin. This isn't the kind of fight I've ever been in. Gregory exhaled slowly, a sound I imagined accompanied by him leaning back in a chair somewhere, taking off his glasses and pinching the bridge of his nose. I pictured him picking up a pen like he did back at that conference. Tomorrow I'll arrange a meeting. Monday morning, 8 a.m., SEC office in downtown St. Paul. I'll be there. Bring all original documents. Make 2 copies if possible. Don't sign anything from the company. Don't email anything. And lock everything up tight. I wrote down everything he said, not because I would forget, but because the act of writing gave me some sense of control. Thank you, Greg. I'm not sure how long I can hold it together. You don't need to be strong, Richard. You just need to be honest. We'll handle the rest. I nodded, though he couldn't see it. See you soon, he said, then hung up. I set the phone down, leaned back in my chair. The wind still whispered outside. The whiskey sat untouched. I stood, walked toward the small office in the back of the house. The desk lamp cast a soft gold glow across the stacks of documents, each one perfectly squared, like folds in an old suit jacket. I opened a drawer, pulled out 2 empty USB drives and a portable hard drive, and began backing up everything. No one told me to do it, but years of being an auditor had taught me to think 3 steps ahead. By midnight, everything was copied. I placed the originals into a fireproof bag, then slipped it behind a false panel in the bookshelf, right where Claire's old letters used to be. I wasn't afraid they'd come looking. I just wanted to make sure that if anything ever happened to me, the truth would still be found. Before going to bed, I pulled Claire's pen from my shirt pocket and laid it on the desk. I ran my fingers along its polished surface, like thanking the woman who had taught me to believe in doing the right thing, even when it made you the odd one out. I turned off the light. The room dimmed, lit only by the faint streetlights spilling through the curtains. I didn't expect to sleep, but for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel powerless. I felt like I was finally beginning. I woke up the next morning at exactly 6:13, earlier than usual. No alarm, no sounds from the street, just the kind of stillness that only comes when your mind won't let you rest. The sky was still gray, but the rain had stopped. Droplets clung to the bedroom window, streaking down in long lines that caught the dull light of an April morning. I brewed a cup of coffee, then sat alone at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a chipped white mug Claire used to hate. Kept it anyway. It wasn't perfect, but it was familiar. Just like me. I picked up my phone. The screen lit up. 5 missed calls. 2 text messages. All from names I recognized far too well. Janet from HR. David Lane. And 1 unfamiliar number I assumed belonged to someone from legal. No apologies. Just carefully worded messages, all skating the edge between polite concern and subtle threat. We need your signature on the severance agreement before the end of the week. If you have any questions about your compensation, please call as soon as possible. This is your final opportunity to resolve matters amicably. I didn't respond, didn't delete them either. I simply flipped the phone over, screen face down on the table, like I was silencing not just the messages but everything they represented. The house was quiet. No TV. No radio. Just the steady ticking of the wall clock and the low hum of the heater. Silence, but not the empty kind. The kind of silence that holds weight. The kind that says, a decision has been made. I didn't leave the house that day. I spent the morning organizing documents, packing up 2 clean sets of evidence, and writing out a bullet point list of everything I needed to share with the SEC on Monday. It felt like prepping for a big presentation. Only this time I wasn't doing it for a boardroom. I was doing it for the truth. Calls kept coming. Around 1 in the afternoon, the landline rang. David. I didn't pick up, but I listened to his voicemail. Richard, I hope you understand this is a sensitive situation. No one wants things to escalate. If you sign the paperwork from yesterday, we can process your compensation immediately. I'm happy to have someone drop it off if that makes it easier. Just call me back before 5. Okay? He still sounded calm, still in control, but his tone had a wobble to it, like he knew the ground beneath him had started to shift. By 4, the doorbell rang. I looked through the curtain. Janet stood on the porch, holding an envelope, eyes fixed on the ground. I didn't open the door. After a minute, she knocked gently once more, then slipped the envelope into the mailbox and walked away. I waited a few minutes before retrieving it. Inside was a fresh copy of the same agreement, along with a handwritten note. Richard, I'm really sorry. They made me do this. Her signature was scrawled messily at the bottom. I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer beneath the tea bags, someplace no one would think to look. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the row of houses across the street, the golden light in my home softened. I made another pot of tea. No whiskey this time. No caffeine either. Just something warm enough to sit with through the night. The phone vibrated again. Unknown number. Mr. Evans? A firm male voice. This is Henry Malloy, legal counsel on behalf of Grantwood. I'm calling to remind you that if we don't receive your signed agreement by noon tomorrow, the company will consider it a refusal of all benefits. That includes severance and extended insurance coverage. We would prefer to resolve this promptly. I hung up before he could continue. Not out of anger, out of clarity, because I understood now, this wasn't a negotiation. This was pressure disguised as protocol. A soft push meant to look like kindness. A deadline meant to sound like opportunity. But this time I wasn't moving. I left the phone on the counter and stepped out into the backyard. The night was cooler than I expected, but not bitter. I tilted my head to the sky, mostly clouds, with a few faint stars peeking through like chalk marks on slate. Claire used to say, "Silence isn't surrender. Sometimes it's how you make them hear their own noise." I stood there for a long while. The wind slipped through the trees, carrying the smell of damp earth and wildflowers from the lot next door. It was so still, I almost forgot that within hours they'd call again. Try once more. Push a little harder. But not this time. I had been silent my whole life, but never like this. This silence wasn't weakness. It was steel. When I went back inside, I locked the door, drew the curtains, turned off the lights, not because I was afraid, but because I was preparing for the day the truth would speak. Not through my voice, but through every file, every memo, every timestamp I had quietly preserved for years. And then, in the dark, the phone rang again. But this time I didn't reach for it. I walked to my desk instead, opened the silver box, and started documenting everything: the calls, the voicemails, the people who tried to make me go quiet. This wasn't about a contract anymore. This was about a life. On Monday, I woke up before the light reached the bedroom wall.
No alarm clock.
No caffeine needed. Just one thought. Today I will say everything. The Minnesota sky was heavy that morning. Still gray, still cold. As if the world outside understood this wasn't just another start to the week. I wore my navy blue suit, the one I kept for only the most serious of days. Not to impress, but to remind myself that what I was about to do mattered. I placed the briefcase on the passenger seat, checking 3 times to make sure every document was inside: originals, 2 full copies, and a detailed summary index. It felt like preparing for the most important presentation of my life. Only this time, I wasn't representing a company. I wasn't defending a strategy. I was presenting the truth. The SEC office in downtown St. Paul didn't stand out from the street. Just another modern building with reflective windows and upright columns.
No flash sign.
No security theater. Everything was understated, and that's what made it feel serious. When I stepped through the automatic glass doors, the sound of my shoes against the polished floor echoed louder than I expected. A security guard ushered me through, expression neutral, posture firm. People in this building didn't make assumptions. They followed process. And in a strange way, that made me feel safe. Gregory was already waiting in the lobby. He looked a little older than I remembered. Grayer hair, slightly slower steps, but his eyes hadn't changed. Still sharp, still focused, still seeing everything. "Richard," he said, shaking my hand with purpose. "Thank you for coming. They're ready for us." I nodded, saying nothing. We walked down a long corridor lined with glass, the kind that lets in light but keeps the tone cool and quiet. No one smiled. No one made small talk. And I appreciated that. The conference room was minimal. No art, no plants. Just a long wooden table, cushioned chairs, and two people already seated, both flipping through thick files. Gregory gestured. "This is Angela Brennan, Senior Enforcement Counsel, and James Weston, Forensic Accounting." I shook their hands. Angela's grip was firm, her gaze steady. James nodded once, already focused on the documents in front of him. Angela got right to the point. "Before we begin, I need to confirm you understand. By presenting information here today, you are triggering an official investigation. Everything you share will be documented. There's no undoing this." I met her eyes. "I understand. And I'm ready." The next 3 hours passed like surgery, precise, methodical, and emotionless, but vital. I laid out the files in order, one by one: memos, emails, falsified reports, financial summaries with redacted lines reinserted, emails instructing staff to backdate inspections, handwritten notes from a meeting where I was asked to stop recording minutes but didn't. James examined everything carefully, marking certain lines, asking brief questions when necessary. Angela listened, took notes, and clarified dates and names. No wasted words.
No dramatic reactions.
When I explained how I had been let go, 3 days before my pension would fully vest, Angela paused. "Do you have any indication that your termination was connected to your reporting these issues internally?" I nodded. I had refused to sign off on a cost-cutting proposal David Lane was pushing through. It violated quality and compliance protocols. Within a week, I was summoned to HR.
No warnings.
No performance reviews. Just a folder and a goodbye. James sat back, shaking his head slightly. "This company has reported consistent revenue growth for 2 straight years. But based on these documents, they've likely been overstating earnings by nearly 20% each quarter." Angela's voice grew firmer. "That's securities fraud. And if your termination was retaliation, Grantwood is looking at a second legal firestorm under whistleblower protection laws." I said nothing, not because I was uncertain, but because, for the first time, someone was saying what I had known for years. And they were saying it like it mattered. By the end of the session, they had collected all the documentation. Angela outlined the next steps: formal procedures, confidentiality agreements, and the possible timeline for enforcement. Gregory placed a hand on my shoulder as we left the room. "You did the right thing, Richard. And I don't think you're the only one." I walked out of the SEC office into a city that hadn't changed.
No fanfare. No headlines.
Just gray clouds beginning to break, letting a hint of sunlight spill onto the sidewalk. I didn't rush to my car. I walked slowly. I wasn't representing a company anymore. I wasn't wearing a title. But I wasn't just a man with a briefcase either. Something inside me had shifted. I didn't know how long the investigation would take. I didn't know how Grantwood would respond. But I knew one thing: I had not stayed silent. And now the truth was no longer in the drawer. It was walking into the light. News travels faster than you expect. By Wednesday morning, just 2 days after the meeting at the SEC, I got a call from Janet, the HR representative who had handed me the cardboard box when I was let go. Her voice was smaller than usual, almost trembling. "Richard, have you seen the news this morning?" Before I could answer, she went on, like she was afraid she might lose her nerve. "Grantwood's board. They're holding an emergency meeting. David Lane's been suspended. It looks like the SEC has officially notified them about the investigation." I stood in the kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, steam rising from the cup of tea in my hand, fogging up the corner of my glasses. I set the cup down and looked out at the backyard. Sunlight filtered softly through the trees, pale and golden, nothing like the storm-gray skies of earlier in the week. I spoke barely above a whisper. "I guess it started then." Janet was quiet for a moment, then asked something I didn't expect. "Was it you?" I wasn't angry. I wasn't surprised. I just answered calmly, like it was the most natural thing in the world. "I did what was right. What anyone should have done. That afternoon, the movement accelerated. Around noon, I received a formal email from the company asking me to attend a necessary discussion with the executive team. No details, just polite, cautious wording. It reeked of control, wrapped in velvet but still a trap. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I called my attorney, Barbara Linton, a woman in her early 50s, sharp as glass and steady as stone. Former federal prosecutor, now running her own practice. Gregory had connected us, and from our very first conversation, I knew this was the person I wanted beside me in whatever came next. We agreed to attend the meeting, but not at the company. It would happen at her office, neutral ground, and everything would be documented. The next morning, I walked into the conference room, not the old meeting space on the 11th floor, but a high-ceilinged room in a red brick building near downtown. There was a long table, water pitchers, and a silence that settled fast the moment I entered. Around the table were faces I knew. William Hargrove, the board chairman, looked pale and tired. 3 other board members sat with him, plus an external attorney. One face was conspicuously absent. David Lane. Barbara sat beside me, saying nothing, just resting a hand on her folder like a quiet warning that we weren't here for niceties. William began, voice careful, trying to maintain the tone of authority but failing at warmth. Mr. Evans, first, I'd like to express the board's sincere regret for how things have unfolded. I didn't respond. Neither did Barbara. She simply nodded, go on. We've reviewed the circumstances surrounding your termination. Given the timing and lack of proper process, we're formally rescinding the decision. Effective immediately, your pension is reinstated in full. Still, I said nothing, because I hadn't come for back pay. Barbara leaned forward slightly. Mr. Evans submitted dozens of internal reports over the years, each one carefully documented, each one warning of systemic issues. These were ignored. In fact, he was removed from his position days before his full retirement benefits were to vest. That's not just oversight. That's targeted. William avoided eye contact. His fingers laced tightly on the table. We're launching an internal review. An independent audit team has been contracted. We're not denying there were breakdowns. Barbara gave a dry smile, the kind that says, save it. I looked around at the people who once held the reins of power. They weren't towering anymore. They looked tired, cornered. Less like leaders, more like people scrambling to keep the ship from going under. At the end of the meeting, they extended an offer. A ceremonial advisory role for me after retirement. The chance to shape the company's new ethics department. A reasonable compensation package for the difficulties I'd endured. Barbara raised a hand. We're not agreeing to anything today. First, the company must cooperate fully with the SEC. Second, all further discussions will be through legal channels. I stood and adjusted my suit jacket. Just as I turned to leave, William made one final attempt. Mr. Evans, if you would consider letting the SEC know that the company is taking corrective action, that could go a long way. Your opinion carries weight. I looked him in the eye for the first time. I submitted 47 internal reports over almost a decade, 16 formal memos, requested 9 meetings with executive leadership. I received 2 responses and nothing changed. I will speak the truth. And the truth doesn't change to make anyone more comfortable. Silence.
No rebuttals. No please.
Barbara and I left the room. The morning light cut sharply through the glass panels of the hallway as we walked out. I took a deep breath, deeper than I'd taken in years. This wasn't victory. Not yet, but the same people who had thrown me out the previous Friday were now afraid of me, not because of who I was, but because I held the one thing they couldn't manipulate anymore, the truth. 2 days after the board meeting, I got a call from Patricia Donovan. Her name wasn't unfamiliar. Patricia had once been Grantwood's chief operating officer, a woman who rarely spoke in meetings but was always listened to. She was the opposite of David Lane.
No cheap smiles. No buzzwords.
Just calm presence, earned through years of weathering storms in this industry. She never called me Rich or Buddy like David did. She called me Mr. Evans. Good morning, Mr. Evans, she said, her voice lower than I remembered. I've just been appointed interim CEO by the board. I'd like to meet, not at the company, somewhere you feel comfortable. I believe I owe you a real conversation. I chose to meet at my lawyer's office, a quiet space on the 6th floor of a modest building near the city park. The windows overlooked a row of maple trees just beginning to turn gold. Not fancy, not cold, just private enough for honesty. Patricia arrived right on time, wearing a brown overcoat, eyes shadowed but sharp. When she sat down across from me and Barbara, there was no defensiveness, no performance, just someone sitting in the wreckage, trying to rebuild with what she had left. I'll be direct, she said. Grantwood is in crisis. The SEC is watching closely. 3 board members have resigned. David Lane is facing criminal charges. And you are at the center of it all. I didn't respond. I knew that. I wanted to hear what she would say next. We're reinstating your pension in full. That's already processed. But beyond that, she slid a folder across the table. We'd like to offer you an honorary advisory role. You wouldn't be expected to return to day-to-day operations. Just help us build what we never had, a real ethics division. I looked at the folder. Inside was a generous offer. Full lifetime health care, a compensation package beyond what I expected, and a handwritten note from William Hargrove, the same man who had ignored me for a decade, now offering a shaky apology in blue ink. Patricia waited. She didn't push. She just sat there, hands folded, gaze steady. I opened my mouth softly, calmly, not to attack, just to say what needed to be said. I appreciate the offer, I said, but I won't be returning. She didn't look surprised, just quietly sad. I understand, she said. Truly, I exhaled. My hand rested gently on the still unopened folder. I'm not saying no because of the money, or because I don't think I have anything left to give. I'm saying no, because I need to be free. The room went quiet, the kind of quiet that lets truth land without echo. I gave nearly 30 years to a system built on procedures and protocol. I believed that if I worked hard, stayed honest, and followed the rules, that system would protect me. I paused, eyes still on the folder. I was wrong, and I learned that lesson too late. Patricia didn't argue. She didn't offer excuses. She just listened, really listened. I'm not walking away from the field, I said, but I'll do it on my terms now. I've agreed to work with the SEC. I'll help them build stronger protections for whistleblowers. Because the next person like me shouldn't have to go through this alone. Barbara placed a hand on my shoulder, a quiet affirmation that I'd said what mattered. Patricia nodded, this time deeper, like a bow, like respect. I hope one day you'll reconsider, she said. Not because we need you, but because I believe you still have something powerful to give. I didn't promise anything. I just offered her a small, honest smile. When she left, I stood by the window and watched her cross the street beneath those turning maple leaves. She no longer carried a contract. She carried respect. And that was something they'd owed me for a very long time. I turned back to the desk, opened a new notebook, wrote the first line in the next chapter of my life. No longer bound by glass walls, unread emails, or boardroom silence. For the first time in 30 years, I had the right to say no. And that no was called freedom. 6 months later, I sat in a federal courtroom, 3rd row from the front. To my left was one of the SEC attorneys. To my right, a man I didn't know, probably a reporter. At the front of the room, David Lane walked in. He no longer looked like the man I remembered. No $1,000 suit. No confident stride. Just a slouched figure in a dark, off-the-rack suit. Collar askew. Shadows under his eyes. He didn't meet anyone's gaze. He walked with his head down, like the very floor of the courtroom understood he was stepping over something broken, something beyond repair. I watched him without anger, without satisfaction, just silence. When the judge accepted the plea deal, the courtroom hushed. David Lane and 2 former board members formally admitted to securities fraud and intentional deception of shareholders. Each received their own sentence, but the true punishment wasn't in the years ahead. It was in the eyes around them, no longer filled with admiration or fear, but disappointment, contempt, indifference. As David turned to leave, our eyes met briefly. It wasn't a stare down. It wasn't a fight. It was recognition. He knew I hadn't stayed silent. He knew I'd stood up, and that was enough. After the trial, I returned to my new house by the lake, just over an hour outside the city. I'd moved in about 2 months earlier, once the investigations and hearings had slowed. A small home, wooden shingles, 2 stories, a wide porch with a swing where I drank tea each morning and listened to the birds and the water. My son Daniel had moved nearby too. He brought his 2 kids, Ellie and Max, and a whole life I hadn't realized I still had room for. But it turns out, the laughter of children in the evening, the sound of little feet racing across wet grass, was something I needed far more than any quarterly earnings report. I used the company's settlement and the SEC whistleblower reward to create a scholarship. It's called the Claire Evans Memorial Fund. It supports young women pursuing careers in ethics and corporate governance. The name is now etched on a small bronze plaque at a university in Iowa, where Claire once dreamed of teaching. One afternoon, I got a letter from a junior year student. She wrote, "I read your story in the news. I never thought accounting required courage. But now I believe I can do the right thing, even when I have to stand alone." I folded the letter slowly, didn't say anything, but my hands shook, just a little. Grantwood still exists, but it's not the same. The company was restructured top to bottom. 5 new board members were brought in. An ethics division was created decades late, but it exists now. They still send me the annual report every year. Maybe as a formality, maybe as an apology. I read them. Sometimes I laugh at the corporate language, at terms I was once told to simplify for clarity. One evening, Daniel and I were fishing off the small dock behind the house. The lake was calm. The sun was just starting to set, turning the surface of the water to glass. He looked over and asked, "Do you ever regret staying at Grantwood all those years?" I stared straight ahead, and in that moment, a lifetime of late nights, missed holidays, ignored warnings, quiet resistance. All of it played back in my mind, and I shook my head. "No," I said. "I regret that I had to expose them. I regret that the system allowed it to go that far. But I don't regret staying. Because if I hadn't, who would have known?" Daniel nodded, didn't say anything else. But that one nod, that quiet acknowledgement, was the first time I felt like he understood. This wasn't a comeback. This wasn't revenge. It was a closing, a clear period at the end of a long, difficult sentence. And from there, a new paragraph could begin.
Im noaru.
I'm just a man who held onto his principles, even when they left me isolated. Even when they didn't pay. Even when the room went quiet. But that choice, the one to do the right thing when no one's watching, turned out to be the only thing that stayed with me after everything else was gone. One evening, I sat alone on the porch swing, watching the sun dip behind the lake, and I smiled, not because everything was perfect, but because, in the end, I hadn't let anyone take the one thing that mattered most: integrity. And to me, that is a legacy big enough to leave behind.